"You're a burden in this house, Margaret." Ashley said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather, like the words didn't carry any weight at all, and for a moment, the only sound in the dining room was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. The same clock my husband had hung there 20 years ago when this house still felt like a home and not a place I had to justify my presence in. I didn't respond. I didn't even look up right away. Instead, I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the familiar texture of the linen napkin beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something small and real while the rest of the moment tried to tilt out of control. Daniel cleared his throat across the table, but he didn't correct her. He didn't say my name. He didn't say Mom. He just stared down at his plate like he was studying the pattern on the china, like if he focused hard enough, he wouldn't have to choose a side. That was when I understood something I think I had been avoiding for months. Maybe longer. This wasn't just Ashley speaking. This was a decision that had already been made. I lifted my eyes then, slowly, meeting hers. She didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened, her shoulders pulling back like she was preparing for an argument she thought she'd already won. The overhead light caught the edge of her glass, sending a sharp reflection across the table, and, for a brief second, it reminded me of the way sunlight used to hit the hardwood floors in the morning when Robert would open the curtains and call me into the kitchen for coffee. Back then, this room was filled with warmth. Voices. Laughter that echoed down the hallway. Now it felt too quiet. Too measured. Like every word had to be weighed before it was spoken. I reached for my water, took a small sip, and set the glass back down with deliberate care. No sudden movements. No raised voices. Just stillness. Ashley let out a soft, almost impatient sigh. "We're just being realistic," she added, her tone shifting into something softer, almost rehearsed. "This house is too much for you. The stairs, the maintenance, the bills. It's not practical." Practical. I repeated the word silently, letting it settle. This house had never been about practicality. It was built on 35 years of saving, of choosing modest vacations instead of extravagant ones, of fixing things ourselves when we couldn't afford to hire someone else. I could still picture Robert standing in the driveway, sleeves rolled up, paint on his hands, telling me one day this place would belong to our family for generations. I wondered, briefly, what he would think if he could see this moment now. If he could hear the way his son sat in silence while his wife called me a burden at the very table he had refinished by hand. "Mom," Daniel finally said, his voice low, almost careful, as if he was stepping around something fragile. "Ashley's not trying to be harsh. We've just been talking, and maybe it's time to consider other options." Other options. I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering it, as if I hadn't already heard enough to know exactly where this was going. My eyes drifted to the end of the table, to the empty chair that used to belong to Robert. It had been 6 months since he passed, and still, sometimes I expected to see him there, leaning back with that quiet smile of his, the kind that said he saw more than he ever needed to say. I wondered what he would have told me to do. Then I remembered. Robert never raised his voice either. He didn't need to. He handled things quietly. Thoroughly. I let out a small breath and straightened in my chair. "You might be right," I said, my voice even, calm enough that it seemed to catch Ashley slightly off guard. Daniel looked up then, just for a second, surprise flickering across his face before he quickly masked it again. I gave them both a small, polite smile, the kind I had perfected over decades of family dinners and difficult conversations. "Maybe it is time we talk about what's practical." My fingers brushed lightly against the side of my sweater, feeling the faint outline of the folded document tucked safely inside the pocket, and for the first time that evening, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop questioning what you're seeing and accept it for exactly what it is. I stayed seated for a moment after the conversation ended, long enough to hear Ashley gather the plates with a little more force than necessary, long enough to notice how Daniel stood up without looking at me, muttering something about an early meeting the next morning as if that could excuse the silence he had chosen at the table, and when I finally rose, I did so slowly, pressing my palm lightly against the edge of the chair Robert used to sit in, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. Like it might still hold some trace of him, some quiet reassurance that I was not imagining what had just happened. But the house did not offer reassurance anymore, it only echoed with absence. With small changes that had been happening one by one over the past few months, changes I had noticed, but never fully acknowledged until now. The hallway light was dimmer than it used to be, a cooler bulb Ashley had insisted on replacing because she said the warm lighting felt outdated, and as I walked toward the staircase, I realized how many things had shifted without my permission. The framed photographs on the wall rearranged, Robert's old coat no longer hanging by the door, the small table near the entryway replaced with something sleek and unfamiliar, as if someone had been carefully erasing the history of this house piece by piece while I was still living inside it. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, listening, not for voices but for the silence between them, the kind of silence that tells you more than words ever could, and I could hear Ashley in the kitchen speaking in a lower tone now. Her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments, something about timing, something about listings, and Daniel responding in short, hesitant phrases, the way he always did when he was trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. I did not need to hear every word to understand the conversation. I had already heard enough at the table. I turned away before they could notice me standing there, climbing the stairs one step at a time, each one steady, deliberate, as if I were measuring the distance between the life I thought I still had and the truth that had finally revealed itself tonight. When I reached my bedroom, I closed the door softly behind me and leaned against it for a brief moment, letting the quiet settle around me, the familiar scent of lavender from the drawer sachets still lingering in the air, unchanged, untouched. One of the few things that remained exactly as I had left it, and I crossed the room to the dresser, my fingers brushing over the surface until they found the framed photograph of Robert and me taken on our 25th anniversary, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling in a way that felt effortless back then, before time and circumstance reshaped everything into something quieter, something more complicated. "You always said to pay attention," I murmured under my breath, my voice barely audible even to myself, remembering the way he used to notice things others missed, the small inconsistencies, the subtle shifts in behavior that signaled something deeper was at play. And I realized that the signs had been there for a long time, in the way Ashley stopped asking me for input, in the way Daniel began referring to decisions as things we had already discussed without me, in the way the house felt less like mine with each passing week even though I had never left it. I opened the top drawer slowly and reached inside, moving aside neatly folded sweaters until my fingers found the envelope I had placed there earlier that day, thick, official, the weight of it familiar now, and I brought it out carefully, holding it in both hands as I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me in a way that still felt like home, even if everything else was beginning to feel uncertain. I did not open the envelope right away. I already knew what was inside. Instead, I traced the edge of it with my thumb, remembering the quiet office, the steady voice that had explained everything to me with patience and clarity, and for the first time since Robert passed, I felt something settle into place inside me, not grief, not confusion, but a kind of understanding that made everything else seem sharper, more defined. Downstairs, I heard the faint sound of a cabinet closing, then footsteps, then silence again, and I let that silence stretch, unbroken, because now I understood it for what it was, not empty, but full of intention. Full of decisions that had already been made without me, and I knew, as I sat there with that envelope resting in my hands, that they believed this house was already theirs, that they believed I would step aside quietly, that I would accept their version of what was practical, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of amusement, but out of certainty, because they had mistaken my silence for weakness, and that was the one mistake they would not see coming. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that settles into a house when no one feels the need to speak unless it is necessary, and I woke before the sun had fully risen, out of habit more than anything else, my body still keeping the same rhythm it had followed for decades when Robert would already be downstairs making coffee, the faint clatter of mugs and the soft whistle of the kettle pulling me gently from sleep, but now there was only stillness. And I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the night before settle into something clearer, something less emotional and more precise, like a picture finally coming into focus after being blurred for too long. I got up slowly, smoothing the blanket behind me, the simple act grounding me, and made my way downstairs, noticing immediately that something else had changed. Something small but telling. The spare set of keys that used to hang on the hook by the door was gone. And I paused there for just a second, my eyes resting on the empty space where they had always been, not because I needed those keys, but because I understood what their absence meant. It was not about convenience, it was about control. In the kitchen, Ashley was already there, dressed neatly, her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, her expression composed in that way she had mastered, pleasant on the surface, but distant underneath. And she glanced at me briefly before returning her attention to whatever message she was reading, as if my presence required only the smallest acknowledgement. "Good morning," I said, my tone even, the same as it had always been, and she nodded without looking up. Daniel entered a few moments later, adjusting his tie, his movements quick, efficient, avoiding unnecessary interaction, and when his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something there. Not quite guilt, not quite concern, but something unsettled. Something he did not want to examine too closely. "Morning," he said, already reaching for his briefcase. No one mentioned the conversation from the night before. No one needed to. It lingered in the air between us, unspoken but understood, shaping every movement, every glance. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noticing that the brand had changed again, something stronger, something Ashley preferred, and I took a sip without comment, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue as I moved to the small desk near the window. The one place in the house that still felt like mine, where the light came in just right in the early hours of the day. That was when I saw it, a folder left slightly open, just enough to reveal the edge of a document inside, and I did not need to search for it, did not need to move anything out of place, because the words were already visible from where I stood. Printed clearly in bold letters at the top of the page, "Real Estate Listing Agreement." I let my gaze rest on it for a moment longer than necessary, long enough to confirm what I already knew, long enough to understand that they were not just talking about possibilities anymore, they were taking steps, making arrangements, moving forward as if the outcome had already been decided, and I felt no surge of anger, no sharp reaction, only a steady clarity that settled deeper with each passing second. Ashley followed my line of sight then, her expression tightening just slightly before she closed the folder with a quick, controlled motion, her smile returning almost immediately as she turned toward me. "Just some paperwork," she said lightly, as if the explanation were sufficient, as if I would accept it without question. I nodded once, calmly, because there was no need to challenge her, no need to expose what I had seen. Not yet, and Daniel shifted his weight beside her, his fingers tightening around the handle of his briefcase as he glanced between us, sensing the tension even if he did not fully understand it. "We should get going," he said, his voice a little too quick, a little too eager to move past the moment, and Ashley agreed, slipping her phone into her bag and reaching for her keys, the ones that now included every set that used to hang by the door. They left together without another word, the front door closing behind them with a soft, final sound, and I remained where I was, the house settling back into silence once more, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but still controlled. As if everything had shifted into place exactly as it needed to, and I walked slowly to the desk, opened the folder they had tried to hide in plain sight, and read the document fully, taking in every detail, every date, every signature. Line left waiting, and when I closed it again, I did so carefully, placing it back exactly as I had found it, because now I knew with absolute certainty what they believed was about to happen, and more importantly, I knew exactly when I would choose to prove them wrong. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in months. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, not because I needed their permission, but because I had grown accustomed to the quiet understanding that my movements no longer mattered to them. And as I stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, clearer, as if the world beyond those walls had been waiting patiently for me to notice it again, and I walked to my car slowly, taking in the familiar sight of the driveway. The flower beds Robert had insisted on planting himself even when his knees had begun to ache, the small cracks in the pavement we always said we would fix, but never quite got around to, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember how this place used to feel. Not as an asset or a negotiation, but as a life we had built piece by piece. The drive into town was quiet, the roads lined with the same shops and houses that had been there for years, unchanged in a way that felt almost comforting, and when I pulled into the parking lot of the law office, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that this was a step, a quiet one, but significant all the same. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the kind of place where everything had its place and nothing was left to chance, and when I gave my name at the front desk, the receptionist smiled with polite familiarity before asking me to take a seat. Her voice calm, professional, as if she had no idea that the document I carried with me was about to reshape everything that had been quietly unfolding in my home. It did not take long before I was shown into a private office, and when Mr. Harrison entered, he greeted me with the same steady warmth I remembered, his handshake firm, his expression attentive, as if he had already sensed the weight of why I had come back. "Mrs. Collins," he said, taking a seat across from me, "how can I help you today?" I placed the envelope on the desk between us, sliding it forward slightly, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if we both understood that what was about to be discussed did not require urgency. Only clarity. "I need to make sure I understand everything correctly," I said finally, my voice even, measured, the way I had learned to speak when emotions threatened to interfere with logic. He nodded, opening the envelope and removing the document with practiced care, his eyes scanning the pages briefly before looking back at me. "Your husband was very thorough," he said, and there was something in his tone that felt almost respectful, not just of the document, but of the man who had ensured it existed. "This property is solely in your name, Mrs. Collins. It has been for several years now." I let the words settle, not because I was hearing them for the first time, but because hearing them spoken aloud carried a different kind of weight, one that replaced any lingering doubt with certainty. "And there is no claim against it?" I asked, not out of fear, but out of precision. "None," he replied without hesitation. "No transfer, no shared ownership, no legal standing for anyone else unless you choose to grant it." I nodded once, absorbing the finality of that statement, and for a brief moment, I thought of Daniel, of the way he had sat at the table that morning, speaking about practicality as if it were a simple matter of logistics, and I realized that he did not know, not fully, not in the way that mattered. Ashley might suspect, might have assumed, but assumption was not the same as truth, and truth had a way of revealing itself at exactly the right moment. "If someone were to attempt to sell the property without my consent," I continued, choosing each word carefully, "what would happen?" Mr. Harrison's expression did not change, but there was a slight narrowing of his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the direction this conversation was taking. "It would not be legally possible," he said. "Any agreement would be invalid. Any attempt would be stopped the moment it required your authorization." I allowed myself a small breath, not of relief, but of confirmation, because that was what I had come for, not reassurance, but verification, something solid to anchor the decision that had already begun forming in my mind. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door, his voice lowering slightly as he added, "If you need to take further steps, Mrs. Collins, I am here to assist you." I met his gaze briefly, offering a polite, composed smile. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, not just for his time, but for the clarity he had provided, the kind that made everything else fall into place without the need for confrontation or raised voices. As I stepped back outside, The late afternoon light stretched across the parking lot, long and steady, and I paused for just a moment, looking up at the sky, feeling that same sense of calm settle over me again, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question. Nothing left to guess, only the quiet understanding of what needs to be done next, and as I got into my car and closed the door behind me, I knew that whatever conversation awaited at that table again, it would not unfold the way they expected, because now, every piece of the truth was exactly where it needed to be. When I returned home that evening, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, not uncertain, not heavy, but settled, as if everything had already shifted beneath the surface and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. And I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, my eyes moving instinctively through the space, taking in every detail with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, the arrangement of the furniture, the absence of certain things, the presence of others that had never truly belonged to me, and I set my keys down on the counter with deliberate care, placing them exactly where they had always been, even though I knew they were no longer the only set that mattered in this house. I moved through the room slowly, not searching, not investigating, but observing, noticing the small signs of a life being reorganized without my consent, a new stack of brochures on the kitchen island, glossy images of modern homes and staged interiors, the kind of places that looked impressive in photographs but carried no history, no memory, no sense of belonging, and I flipped through one of them briefly, my fingers tracing the edges of the pages before I set it back exactly where I had found it, leaving no sign that I had touched it at all. Upstairs, my bedroom remained unchanged, a quiet island in a house that was steadily becoming something else, and I walked to the dresser, opening the drawer where the envelope rested, taking it out once more, not because I needed to read it again, but because holding it reminded me of something important, something steady and real that could not be altered by assumption or convenience. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, the same place I had sat the night before, and allowed my thoughts to move forward, not backward, considering not what had been lost, but what would come next, because for the first time since Robert passed, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me, I was deciding how it would unfold. I placed the envelope back in the drawer, closing it softly, and stood, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my sweater before leaving the room, my steps measured, my posture steady, because there was no urgency now, no need to rush or confront or explain, only the quiet certainty that timing mattered more than anything else. When I returned downstairs, I began preparing dinner as I always had, moving through the routine with practiced ease, the rhythm of it familiar, almost comforting, and when Daniel and Ashley arrived home, their voices carrying faintly through the front door before it opened, I did not turn to greet them immediately, allowing them to enter the space without interruption, to settle into the evening as they normally would, unaware that anything had changed. "Something smells good," Daniel said as he stepped into the kitchen, his tone casual, as if the previous night had already faded into something insignificant, and I nodded slightly, continuing to stir the pot on the stove, the steady motion grounding me in the moment. Ashley set her bag down on the counter, her eyes scanning the room briefly before landing on me, and there was a flicker of something there, something assessing, as if she were trying to determine whether I had accepted what had been said, whether I had begun to adjust to the future she had already planned. "We should talk tonight," she said, her voice controlled, confident, as if she were setting the terms of a conversation she believed she would lead, and I turned then, meeting her gaze with the same calm expression I had worn the night before. "Of course," I replied simply, my tone neither resistant nor agreeable, just even, and Daniel glanced between us, his shoulders tightening slightly, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold even if he did not yet understand its shape. We sat down at the table a few minutes later, the same table where everything had begun to unravel, the same chairs, the same arrangement, but something about the space felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was no longer sitting there as someone waiting to be told what would happen. Next, I was sitting there knowing exactly what I would choose to reveal and when, and as Ashley began to speak, outlining her version of what was practical, what made sense, what would be best for everyone. I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture composed, allowing her to finish every sentence, every carefully structured argument, because there was no need to stop her, no need to challenge her logic. Not yet. And when she finally paused, expecting a response, expecting perhaps resistance or hesitation, I simply nodded once, my expression thoughtful, measured, as if I were considering everything she had said, and in that moment, I could see it clearly, the confidence in her posture, the assumption in her tone, the quiet certainty that she believed this conversation would end exactly the way she intended, and I allowed a small silence to settle between us before I spoke, not to argue, not to explain, but to take the first step in a direction neither of them had anticipated. I let the silence stretch just long enough for it to feel intentional, not uncomfortable, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, the same tone I had used for years when settling disagreements or guiding conversations back to something reasonable. Except this time I was not guiding anything, I was simply placing a marker in the middle of the table that neither of them could ignore. "I think you are right," I said, folding my hands lightly in front of me, my eyes moving from Ashley to Daniel without urgency, without accusation. "It is time we talk about what is practical." Ashley's shoulders relaxed slightly, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching closely, and Daniel exhaled, almost imperceptibly, as if he had been bracing himself for resistance that never came, and I could see it in both of them. The quiet assumption that this conversation was already moving in their favor. Ashley leaned forward just a little, her voice taking on that measured, persuasive tone again, the one she used when she believed she was being reasonable. "We just want what is best for everyone," she said, her fingers resting lightly on the table, her posture confident. "There are beautiful senior communities nearby, places with support, activities, people your age. It would be a much better fit than staying here alone." I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering her words, letting them settle in the space between us, and I noticed the way she avoided saying certain things directly, the way she framed everything as concern rather than intention, as if the outcome would somehow feel different depending on how it was presented. Daniel cleared his throat, finally adding his voice to the conversation. "We could help you find something comfortable," he said, his eyes still not quite meeting mine, his focus drifting somewhere just past my shoulder. "Something manageable." Manageable. The word lingered for a moment, and I let it, not because it held power, but because it revealed more than either of them intended. I reached for my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down carefully before responding. "And the house?" I asked, my tone neutral, curious, as if I were simply trying to understand their plan. Ashley answered without hesitation. "It would make sense to sell it," she said, her voice smooth, confident, as if the decision had already been finalized somewhere outside this room. "The market is strong right now, and it is too much space to maintain. It could be a good opportunity." I watched her for a moment, noting the certainty in her expression, the way she spoke not in possibilities, but in conclusions, and I turned my gaze to Daniel, giving him the chance to respond, to correct, to clarify, but he only nodded. His agreement quiet, almost automatic. That was when I understood that this was not a discussion they had just begun. This was a plan they had already accepted, one that had been forming in conversations I was never part of, decisions made in rooms I was no longer invited into. I let a small pause settle again, not to create tension, but to give their words space to exist fully, to hang in the air without interruption, and then I gave a slight nod, my expression thoughtful. "That sounds very organized," I said, my tone even, almost appreciative, and Ashley's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that appears when someone believes they have been understood, when they think the hardest part of a conversation is already behind them. Daniel shifted in his chair, his posture easing just slightly, as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to accept what they had decided. I rested my hands lightly on the table again, my fingers still, my posture composed, and I allowed one more breath to pass before speaking, not to challenge them, Not yet, but to move the conversation forward in a way they did not expect. Then I suppose we should look at everything carefully, I said, my voice quiet but clear, and I could see the anticipation in Ashley's eyes, the readiness to continue outlining her plan, to move into details, timelines, next steps, but I was not finished. Not with what I intended to say, and not with how this would unfold, because while they believed they were guiding this conversation toward a conclusion, I knew something they did not, something that had already changed the outcome before. They ever sat down at this table, and as I met Ashley's gaze once more, I held it just long enough for the moment to settle into something steady, something inevitable, because what came next would not require raised voices or arguments. Only the quiet presentation of a truth they had never bothered to confirm. I reached into the pocket of my sweater slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. As if something in the air had shifted just enough for them to sense that the conversation was no longer following the path they had carefully laid out, and I placed the folded document on the table between us without a word, aligning it neatly with the edge of the wood, the same way I had aligned countless things in this house over the years, small acts of order that once made this place feel stable, predictable, ours. Ashley's eyes dropped to it first, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as she studied the paper without touching it, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing in quiet confusion, the certainty from earlier beginning to falter at the edges. I did not rush them. I let the silence settle, let their curiosity build into something heavier, something that demanded acknowledgement, and only then did I speak. Before we talk about selling anything, I said, my voice even, calm enough that it carried no edge, I thought it might be helpful for us to look at this together. Ashley hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for the document, unfolding it carefully, her movements slower now, more deliberate, and I watched her eyes move across the page, line by line, the confidence in her posture beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough for me to see it, enough to know that the assumptions she had built this conversation on were starting to loosen. Daniel leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, his expression changing in stages, confusion first, then something sharper, something that resembled realization, but had not yet fully formed into understanding. I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, my gaze steady, not pressing, not explaining, simply allowing the document to speak in the way it was designed to, clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. I do not understand, Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than before, as if he were unsure how much weight his words should carry in this moment. Ashley did not respond right away. She kept reading, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning the same section more than once, as if repetition might change what was written there. It means, I said gently, not to interrupt, but to complete the thought he had begun, that this house has been in my name for quite some time. The words settled into the space between us, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet finality that did not require emphasis. Daniel straightened in his chair, pulling back slightly as if distance might help him process what he was seeing, and Ashley lowered the paper just enough to meet my eyes, her expression carefully composed, but no longer certain. "That cannot be right," she said, her tone controlled, but thinner now, the confidence from earlier replaced by something more cautious. I tilted my head slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. "It is," I replied simply. "It was arranged years ago." I did not mention Robert's name. I did not need to. His presence was already there, woven into every line of that document, every decision that had been made long before this conversation ever began. Ashley folded the paper slowly, more carefully than before, as if the act itself required precision, and placed it back on the table, her fingers lingering on the edge for just a moment before she withdrew her hand. Daniel looked from her to me, his expression unsettled now, the easy certainty he had carried into this evening gone, replaced by questions he had not thought to ask until now. "So what does that mean?" he asked, his voice quieter, more uncertain than I had ever heard it. I held his gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to explain beyond the truth itself. It means, I said, my voice steady, measured, that before any decisions are made about this house, they will be made by me. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before, not empty, not uncertain, but full, weighted with the understanding that the balance of this conversation had shifted, not through argument or emotion, but through something far simpler, something they had never taken the time to confirm. And as I sat there, my hands still, my posture composed, I realized that for the first time since this began, I was not being positioned within their plan, I was defining it, quietly. Completely, and without needing to raise my voice at all. Daniel did not speak immediately after my words settled across the table, and that silence, heavier now, stretched longer than any we had shared before, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said could not be undone. And I watched him carefully, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet observation, the same way I had watched him as a child when he struggled to understand something difficult, except now there was no guidance I could offer, no simple explanation that would make this easier for him. Ashley, however, recovered more quickly, her composure returning in small, deliberate movements, the straightening of her posture, the slight lift of her chin, the way she folded her hands together as if gathering control back into herself piece by piece. "Margaret," she began, her voice measured, softer than before but carrying a new edge beneath it. "No one is trying to take anything from you." I did not interrupt her. I let her continue, because I understood now that this was not about convincing me, it was about preserving her position, reshaping the narrative into something that still worked in her favor. "We are only trying to find a solution that makes sense," she added, her eyes steady on mine, searching for any sign that I might waver, that I might soften, that I might return to the version of myself she had already planned around. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without accepting them, and Daniel shifted beside her, his hands clasping and unclasping in a rhythm that betrayed his uncertainty. His gaze moving between us, as if he were waiting for one of us to define what came next. "I understand what you are trying to do," I said finally, my tone calm, free of accusation, because there was no need to argue intent when the outcome had already been made clear. Ashley's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed it over again. "Then you understand why staying here alone is not ideal," she replied, her voice firmer now, as if she were trying to regain ground she felt slipping away. I let a small pause settle between us before answering, not to create tension, but to make sure every word I spoke carried exactly the weight it needed. "I understand that you have made plans," I said, my gaze steady, plans that did not include asking me what I wanted. The words were simple, but they landed with a quiet precision that shifted something in the room again, and Daniel looked down at the table, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if the truth in that statement was something he could not easily dismiss. Ashley drew in a breath, her fingers tightening together briefly before she released them, her composure still intact but no longer effortless. "We assumed you would agree," she said, and there it was, the word that revealed everything, not a suggestion, not a discussion, but an assumption. I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition. "Yes," I said softly, "you did." I let the silence follow again, not rushing to fill it, allowing them to sit with that realization, with the understanding that what they had built their plans on was not fact, but expectation. And expectation has a way of unraveling when it is not supported by truth. I reached for the document once more, not to present it again, but to slide it gently back toward myself, my fingers resting lightly on its surface for a moment before I folded it with the same care Ashley had used earlier. "This house is not something that can be decided for me," I continued, my voice steady, each word measured, "and it is not something that will be sold because it is convenient for someone else." Daniel looked up then, his expression more open now, less guarded, as if he were beginning to see the situation from a perspective he had not allowed himself to consider before. Ashley, however, remained composed, though the confidence that had filled her earlier words was no longer as certain, replaced by something more calculated, more cautious. "What are you saying?" she asked, her tone controlled, but quieter now, as if she already sensed the answer. I met her gaze without hesitation, not with confrontation, but with clarity. "I am saying," I replied, "that I will decide what happens next, and until I do, nothing changes." The words did not rise in volume, did not demand attention, but they carried a finality that settled into the room with a quiet force, and as I sat there, my hands still, my posture unchanged, I could see it in both of them. The shift from assumption to uncertainty, from control to hesitation, and I realized that this was not a moment that required anything more. No raised voices, no further explanation, because the balance had already changed, and they could feel it just as clearly as I could. Daniel did not reach for the document again after I spoke, and that, more than anything, told me how much had shifted, because only hours earlier he would have leaned forward, questioned every line, searched for some explanation that fit the version of events he had already accepted, but now he simply sat there, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the space between us, as if he were trying to understand how something so certain had become something so fragile in the span of a single conversation. Ashley, on the other hand, remained composed, but it was no longer the same kind of composure, no longer effortless or assured. It was controlled, deliberate, the kind that requires attention to maintain. And I could see it in the way her fingers pressed lightly against the table, the way her shoulders held steady even as the ease had left her posture. "So that is it?" she asked after a moment, her voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier confidence that had carried her arguments. "Nothing changes?" I considered her question, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood that how I responded would define everything that followed, and I let a small pause settle before I spoke, giving the moment the weight it deserved. "Not the way you planned," I said calmly, my gaze steady, my tone even, and Daniel finally looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time that evening, something in his expression shifting, not just uncertainty now, but recognition, as if he were beginning to see the distance between what he thought this situation was and what it had always been. I moved the document fully back into my possession, folding it once more and placing it beside my plate, not as a barrier, not as a threat, but as a simple fact, something that existed whether it was acknowledged or not. "This house," I continued, my voice quiet but clear, "is not a problem to solve. It is my home." The words did not need emphasis. They did not need repetition. They settled into the space between us with a clarity that did not invite debate, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence returning again, but this time it felt resolved, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, like something that had reached its natural conclusion. Daniel shifted in his chair, his shoulders lowering slightly as if something inside him had finally given way, and when he spoke, his voice was different, softer, less certain of itself. "We thought," he began, then stopped, the sentence falling apart before it could be completed, and I watched him for a moment, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that sometimes realization comes too late to change what has already been revealed. Ashley inhaled slowly, her posture straightening again as she gathered herself, the control returning in careful layers, and she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she were recalculating, adjusting to a situation that no longer followed the path she had expected. "We will need to rethink things," she said, her tone measured, the words chosen with care, and I inclined my head slightly, accepting the statement without offering more, because there was nothing left to negotiate in this moment, nothing left to clarify. I stood then, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but simply as a natural end to the conversation, smoothing my hands lightly against the table before stepping away, leaving the document where it was, within my reach. And as I walked toward the hallway, I could feel their eyes on me, not questioning, not challenging, but following, as if they were seeing me differently now, not as someone to be guided or managed, but as someone who had never needed their direction in the first place. I paused briefly at the base of the stairs, glancing once more at the room that had held so many versions of this family over the years, the laughter, the arguments, the quiet dinners that meant more than they ever said aloud. And I realized that nothing about the house had changed, not really, only the way it had been perceived, the assumptions placed upon it, the expectations that had tried to reshape it into something it was never meant to be. And as I turned and walked upstairs, my steps steady, unhurried, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, not because everything was resolved, but because the truth no longer needed to be defended. It simply existed, clear and immovable, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt like mine again, not because of the document resting on the table, but because I had finally claimed the space I had never truly